From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Biden administration announces the first prescription drugs that will be put under price controls via the Inflation Reduction Act. But how will this affect drug development, and is it constitutional? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. The Inflation Reduction Act requires the federal government to negotiate, quote unquote, prices for top drugs in Medicare, starting with 10 this year and reaching 60 by 2029. And on Tuesday, President Biden announced the first 10 drugs to go under those price controls. Here is a piece of what he said.
Big Pharma doesn't want this to happen, as you might expect. Last year, the industry spent $400 million in lobbying fees to try to stop the Inflation Reduction Act and block the ability of the federal government to lower drug prices. And when they failed, they went to federal court to sue the government in an attempt to maintain their exorbitant prices. They're hoping the courts will do what Democrats in Congress wouldn't do, protect the exorbitant profits and keep negotiations from happening. But we're going to see this through. We're going to keep standing up to Big Pharma, and we're not going to back down.
So, Alicia, there you have it from the president. This is all about exorbitant profits. What's your read of this, the 10 drugs that were announced? Any surprises there?
No, actually, I think maybe there was one surprise with the J&J drug that treats Crohn's disease, and that's because it was actually expected to face a generic competition within the next couple of years. And actually, the law lays out some specifications on what the CMS must consider when it selects the drugs. Among the 50 highest spending drugs, it selects 10 now. And as you said, up to 60 or about 60 will be eligible for a negotiation by 2029. And there are certain criteria that the bill lays out for CMS to consider. So industry kind of already predicted some of these drugs, which is why the Bristol Myers of blood thinner Eliquis, Johnson & Johnson's blood thinner Xarelto, a lot of these are known as among the highest gross spending drugs. And what you have to consider Medicare gross spending is not the net spending. So the president says that these 10 drugs account for about $50 billion in Medicare Part D, that's the prescription drug program, in gross spending, and that's about 20% of its cost. Well, actually, Medicare Part D's net spending is about half that, $120 billion. And that's because these drug makers already pay rebates to the pharmaceutical benefit managers or the Part D plans for higher placement on the plan formularies. So these prices are actually already negotiated and are not as high as the president makes them out to be. He's calling this a negotiation. And what we have to keep in mind is this really isn't a negotiation, right? So the way it works is that there is no price floor. There's a price ceiling of around 25 to 60% discount off the retail or the drug price. The CMS would actually be required. It has really no discretion over to what extent it can set the prices. This Democrats inserted the required rather than authorized CMS because they were concerned that a future Republican administration would just not participate in these sham negotiations. But really, the rub is that this excise tax, so if drug makers don't participate or they decline the government's price, which it calls the maximum fair price, and it's kind of Orwellian, they'd get slapped with the daily excise tax that starts at about 186% and would eventually climb to 1,900% of the drug's daily revenue. And that's not just including from Medicare, that's its total daily revenue. So they really don't have a choice about whether to participate in these sham negotiations. In mob speak, it's like they're going to make an offer you can't refuse here, with a gun basically pointed at your head. In some ways, that's not actually what goes on in Europe. In Europe, they also have negotiations, but drug makers can walk away from the table and say, sorry, we're not going to offer this drug in this country if they offer too low of a price. Here in the US, under the IRA, drug makers basically have no choice. Otherwise, they'll go out of business.
But it seems to me that this messes with a lot of the incentives in the pharmaceutical business. And the job of a good economist is always to look at the plan put out by the politicians and say, what happens next? And Kim, the Journal's editorial on this today, the headline is Drug Price Controls Mean Slower Cures, raises a series of points about the incentives And the first one I want to bring up here is just that it changes the pricing discussion within these companies as they're launching these drugs. Because if they're going to get quote unquote negotiated down by the federal government, it gives them an incentive to raise the sticker price in the first place. And then if that gets cut for Medicare patients, then it's a higher payment by people who have private insurance. It's another one of these cross subsidizations that are endemic in the healthcare industry and that make healthcare policy so complicated and confusing, not only for policymakers, but for people who are just trying to get their own healthcare taken care of. It's impossible to figure out what the price of anything is because your price is determined by what the other guy across the street pays.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good comparison here to what has already happened in Europe. Europe has been imposing price controls for a long time. And what it has essentially done is make Europe and other countries in the world free riders on the United States. So essentially, Americans have been subsidizing by paying higher costs for a lot of these drugs, Europeans lower prices. Now we're going to do something within the United States, as it were. We're going to limit with these forced non-negotiations the price that the federal government will pay for a certain portion of the population, namely seniors and those who are in the Medicaid program. And as you note, one incentive will be for the manufacturers to launch drugs at higher prices or raise the price of existing drugs, which will continue to be borne by the privately insured. So 218 million people out there that still have private insurance, they're going to pay even more to effectively underwrite this program. But the bigger issue I have here, Kyle, and when we're talking about incentives, because it's just so concerning, the president and that incredibly demagogic statement about exorbitant profits. Okay, pharmaceutical industry certainly makes profits like other industries. That's why people go into business, to make some profit. But vast amounts of their money, in fact, huge amounts, like he was talking about the money they spent on lobbying, that's a fraction of what they pour into research and development. And now they're not going to have an incentive to engage in certain types of that. In particular, the one thing drug makers do, they like to launch drugs that have multiple potential indicators out there. These are markets that maybe can be developed fast, but they're often for rare diseases. They're not going to want to do that now because of the potentiality that if the market actually grows, that they're going to then be hit with these price controls. I mean, this has been the argument against price controls forever. When you impose a price control on something, you get less of it, and usually at a higher price. I mean, the United States has years and many horrible examples of trying this, and it never turns out a different way. It never works. It's really politically shameful in a certain way what they are doing here, pretending that this is a negotiation, when in fact what they're doing is they're trying to get kudos from Americans by claiming they are lowering prices while closing their eyes and not being truthful with the United States about the somewhat devastating consequences this could have for new innovation and new therapies.
So the journal's editorial on this point about new cures raises a working paper out from the University of Chicago, a couple authors there in September of 2021. And it evaluates a House bill called the Lower Drug Costs Now Act, says that it will lead to a 29 to 60% reduction in R&D from 2021 to 2039, translating into 167 to 342 fewer new drug approvals during that period. And Alicia, are we already seeing those kinds of worries and concerns and responses to the Inflation Reduction Act? And by the way, one thing I would add on the point that Kim raised about President Biden's statement, I haven't looked at the profit margins of pharmaceutical companies compared to other large companies, but even if you assume that they are higher, it seems like that's a pretty good incentive for people with capital to go start a new pharmaceutical company, a small one, a biotech firm, and invest in these kind of drugs if they think they can get some of those profits.
A number of things, came to mind here. First, you mentioned the profits, right? And they are higher this year, but the risk is also higher. You have to remember that only about 10% of drugs that are actually, start studies actually get approved. So that's like a 1 in 10 odds. So a lot of drugs that, they start studying in phase 1, 2, 3, or even before that in the mouse studies, they get scrapped because either safety problems or they're just not effective. So when you have higher risk, you just need higher returns. And also basically in the US, companies use their profits and pump it back into research and development. Yes, they at times reward shareholders as well. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to raise capital. But the US model of research and development really relies on these profits. That's not the same way how it works in China, for instance. In China, government funds most of the research and development for these drugs for Chinese companies. And basically, you're handicapping US drug makers and those in the West by basically reducing their profits. It reduces the incentive to innovate and reduces their means to do so. It's kind of ironic because the Biden administration is now trying to copy this China model. It set up this new health agency, ARPA Health, that's right now only funded $1 billion, but is basically in charge of its cancer moonshot. And last week, a lot of scientists and researchers kind of raised eyebrows because the administration gave Emory about $40 million to study mRNA and develop drugs on mRNA. Well, we already have dozens of companies, startups doing exactly that. We don't need the government to be directing funding to do this, what private companies already are doing. But that's kind of the mentality on the left, is that the government should be funding the research. The government should be developing these drugs. And to the extent that they're brought to the private market, then the drug makers would then have to pay royalties to the government, and then the government can set the price. That's kind of how the progressive model or ideal model will work. And you also mentioned, the startups and biotech companies and what we're seeing in terms of whether the incentives are already distorting investment. And yes, we are seeing that, especially in the small molecule space. Small molecule drugs are actually eligible for negotiations 9 years after launching versus 13 for biologics. So, and actually what you've seen in the last year is investment coming out of small molecules and shifting toward biologics. But you've also seen, and it's hard to kind of disentangle what's going on with markets overall, because you've seen kind of a bit of a pop in the biotech funding world, because there were some companies and startups with inflated values, and those have come down as interest rates have risen. But you are seeing the valuations substantially fall. I read somewhere that valuations fell about 75% for these biotech companies in 1 year. And no doubt some of that is just less VC or venture capital is pouring into these companies because they just don't expect to have that return on capital. And some of that return on capital comes from big pharma companies, often big pharma companies buying up smaller ones when they see that drug compounds in the early stage trials actually are successful. And then the bigger companies work to develop them in larger phase 3 trials and then bring them to market. That's kind of how the US model works. But the Biden administration, the IRA, basically blows up the US R&D model. And I think we're going to be dealing with the consequences for many years.